It is my absolute great pleasure to welcome James Evans to CMU. James is the Max Polewski Professor of Sociology, Director of Knowledge Lab, and founding faculty director of computational social science at the University of Chicago and the Santa Fe Institute. It's quite a lot. He has an amazingly distinguished career. You've seen the bio. I'm not going to read this whole thing back to you. You've seen it in the invitation email. But I just want to say, like, James has been doing some of the most interesting work I've seen, trying to understand innovation and knowledge and so how communities online and offline arrive at these great discoveries in science and technology and in other places. And he also has an amazingly distinguished publication record. If you know what these names and acronyms mean, you will be as impressed by this as I am. Is published in Nature, Science, PNAS, the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, and many other outlets, all of them. James, we're really thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for coming, and please.
Thanks for that extremely generous introduction. Thanks for you all being here. What a party! This is a great party. So, I'm gonna put a self-delimiting timer here, so that how long exactly are we talking together? Like, when is this over? 1:15. Okay, I'm gonna set it for 45 minutes, a gentle chime, because I'm less interested in hearing you or having you hear me, and more interested in really hearing what you're interested in. In fact, the reason I was a minute late is because I was like chatting with people. They were interested in all these things that I'm not talking about today. So I was just like trying to squeeze in a few slides, to at the sake of coherence, just so that we can really kick off the conversation. So I want to talk about diversity and the potential to kind of think about designing diversity for sustained innovation. And it'll be overviewing a number of different pieces that I think speak to this in a number of different areas. Science and technology is where I've spent most of the time. So I run the center called Knowledge Lab, which is really focused on large-scale data, machine learning, and kind of intelligent interactive crowdsourcing approaches to representing human culture and knowledge at scale, understanding it, which is to say, understanding its channels, its biases, its pathways, its purposes, and then using that as a effectively statistical instrument to invert it, right? How can we basically transform or change it to do different things as a function of our understanding of its limitations? How do we create complements to that system? And so I'll give some examples. Some of them are early examples, some of them are later examples. In this project, we're trying to think, how does innovation and how does science and technology and economy as systems, as complex systems think, and how can we think in different ways, right? So how can we effectively assay the way in which these systems think in such a way that it allows us to systematically and structurally destabilize them for our purposes? Because we inherit these systems, we inherit these channels. They weren't, many of them, generated for the purposes that we put them to. And so how can we use and really alter them? And it's driven by a kind of market-driven view of knowledge, where you've got a pragmatic action that's kind of calling forth representations and understandings and expectations in the world. We've been trying to kind of push this discussion about the science of science, or research on research, or meta research, or there's like a bunch of kind of competing but friendly classifications to think about this in the scientific space. Like, how do we basically design science from both the bottom up and the top down? Like, how do we become aware of the space and allow the space to recursively pose questions that we haven't posed or couldn't potentially pose? And I've spent a lot of time trying to I hear you're rebranded. How many people are in the new, what is it called? Here, come on. It's the Software, Societal, and Societal Systems. Okay, so we're close. Social computing, this is the new journal that we just started last year. I think it's an exciting frontier to think about. I would say this complex manifold, that kind of lies between computational systems and social systems, and if anyone's interested in kind of try to build such systems for plurality and democracy and other kinds of things. We're kicking off some new conferences that are focused on precisely that, on redesigning election and other systems in ways that kind of reflect, these things at the center, at the interface between technological systems and social systems. I would say the underlying impetus is, trying to understand innovation with what's kind of like hidden by our Zoom participants here, which is what I'll call the generative standard, which is to say, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it. And this idea was kind of put forth in the context of simulation and the first generation of computational social science in the late 90s. But I think we're in a totally different place today with a data-driven computational social science where this question, again, haunts us in an even more exciting and operational way. Can we not just look at, not just observational elements, not just experiments where we're trying to get like a singular treatment effect to suggest that like some factor is a factor, but building, simulated systems and automated systems that if we can't do better as a function of the way in which we understand the innovation process, then we didn't understand the innovation process. So I was just last week with Andy Cooper, for example, in Liverpool, where he has, a building which is effectively a big robot material scientist. And the idea is, okay, how can we make this material scientist, this robochemist, read the literature in intelligent ways that responds to limitations and kind of, things that are understood and not understood by the community, even independent of individuals in the community, in ways that does better at, in our case, identifying photocatalysts, identifying effective water splitters, identifying pharmacological compounds that are useful against a variety of different kinds of diseases. So I think for me that, this tension, this opportunity is like understanding something in such a way that we can build something that compensates for its limitations and facilitates, in some cases, simulation and automation of these things is both a goal and a practice. I won't talk about that, but we're starting a little Institute of Trust and Intelligence. Okay, so the underlying idea that I'm going to kick off with is this wisdom of crowds idea. There's a paper in 1907 in Nature by Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, in which he poses this question, this vox populi, the voice of the people. And he really articulates the way in which the crowd, and in fact, it's ironic in some sense that he was the one to pose this and get the answer that he did. It's not obvious that this was the expected answer. He, as a geneticist and eugenicist, was interested in extreme persons. How can we identify people at the extrema of the population and ignore the rest of the population? And it turns out that his finding by calculating basically the proposed receipts in this West of England fat stock and poultry exhibition. There was a dressed steer, so it wasn't standing up, it was a pile of meat, and people were to evaluate the relative weight of this meat. And it turns out that the median was 12% off, and that the mean was like, less than 0.1% off of the actual weight of the steer. So the median was not 0.8% off. Was there were closer guesses. There were no closer guesses than the mean. No, there was no individual who picked the mean over this. And so the idea is that people have come up with recently. So why is this the case? And when is this the case? When is it not the case, right? So if I were to go to this fat stock and poultry exhibition, and I were to take, a thing and kind of were to try to assess this, the weight of this steer, I'd have no idea, right? But the thing is, all those people at the fat stock and poultry exhibition, each of them had cows. They all had livestock, and they knew the weight of their livestock with respect to not only did they have diverse data, but they had diverse approaches. So there were basically, stock fanciers, there were auctioneers, there were individuals who owned this, so there were people across the value chain who had different metrics or methods. And it turns out that both of these things, diverse data and diverse approaches or analyses that facilitate this possibility of achieving something that's greater than the sum of its parts at the center of the system. And so I'm going to kind of push on that and see the degree to which this might be the case in science and innovation systems more broadly. And I'm going to talk really about and think about, cognitive diversity, perceptual and experiential diversity. I think identity-based diversities, which is really what most of us think of when we think about diversity, are extremely important. I'm not able to access them in most of the studies that I'm looking at here. And one of the reasons why they're important is just really emerging. For example, the degree to which identity-based diversity ends up influencing the outcomes or the uses, the uptakes of the innovations that we come up with. And there are a number of papers just in the last, I would say, 3 years, which suggest not only the importance of these compositions, diverse identity-based compositions for discovery, but these diverse identity-based compositions really for the identification of product categories like women's health, right, is strictly and linearly associated with the proportion of women who are involved in invention in the context of health, the reproductive health. So I'm really thinking about the wisdom of scientific, technological, and business innovating crowds in this context. And I'm going to kind of cross this with, I would say, 3 very loose chapters. One is that innovative crowds are characterized by collective abduction and bridge difference. This is what I'm going to argue. The second is kind of more like a montage of things that suggest that connection and conformity is associated systematically with reduced replication and impeded innovation in a number of these different systems. And then finally, and we're going to bring in some examples from civic knowledge, information and misinformation online, et cetera. And then finally, we're going to explore kind of augmented or alien intelligence, like the least human intelligence, right, that would allow us to kind of design diversity beyond the limits of the human capacity, right, to basically push us in directions that literally aren't present in the context of the crowd that we might otherwise be able to assemble as a function of the people that we have available to us, and how this allows us to accelerate and punctuate advance and they're not toy cases, they're real cases, but they're cases, right? So I think I'd love your thoughts and thinking about other cases and contexts that this could be explored and pushed in. So how do innovative systems think? So I'll take a few cartoons of reasoning first, right? So one cartoon is deduction. The Aristotelian syllogism is the logical extension of new insights from facts or axioms that you are going to assume to be true, whether or not they're empirically justified or validated or not. The second is the Francis Bacon idea of induction, that becomes the heralding claim for the Royal Society that we're going to imaginally generalize from observations. So these are 2 cartoons. They're effectively imagined within person, right? So the thinking agent is the one who thinks up the assumptions, and the thinking agent is the one who identifies the new observed regularities that then get encoded into something else. An alternative approach, which really brings these 2 together in an interesting way, is Charles Sanders Peirce, really the great American philosopher of the 19th century, articulates abduction as effectively, the basis, he argues, for almost every recent advance. Now, recent is 1890 here, and I would say it accelerates over the 20th century. In science, technology, or business, comes from this creative production of hypotheses based on surprising or theory-defying evidence. So you can think of this as like this car wreck here, right? You have some deduction, you set up some experiment, you set up some observation, you put a telescope in the sky, and you're just wrong. Like the world just collides, with your expectation. It just, and so you're stuck inducing as a function of the interface of that deduction, right? So basically, surprise ends up being the thing that generates this. And I will argue that the reason that this actually didn't get as rich play in philosophy as the others, I mean, of course, it's like much later in its articulation, but it's because it systematically occurs not within persons, but across persons, right? So basically, it's typically not the person who, because this idea from Peirce actually suggests the motivation for why we would generate new hypotheses, but not the substance of the new hypothesis that would make the surprising unsurprising. In fact, the person who has the deduction that is surprised is the person that is the least likely to imagine the materials by which that surprising thing would be unsurprising, right? Systematically, like it's selecting across people. And so this is not a philosophical, this is a collective reasoning mode, effectively, I would argue. And Peirce didn't fully, it's kind of great, for him, like he has these Sherlock Holmes descriptions of kind of like intuition and kind of, how like, like this subconscious brain that's actually doing the hypothesis generation. This is how it's actually happening. And it's never kind of across people. And those were unpersuasive. Not that they never happen, not that benzene ring doesn't appear in someone's dream, but that typically these things happen across people. So I would say the challenge for doing this empirically is identifying surprise is different from identifying like the mode of a distribution. And it's different from identifying a trend in the distribution, right? Which requires at least 2 points. It requires a sufficient model that explains almost everything, right? Because you can't articulate or predict that someone is going to be surprised unless you can predict all the ways in which they won't be surprised. And so we're thinking of this novelty in this measurement context here as improbable outcome. So it's being either proportional or more loosely a decreasing function of the probability. Here, I'm going to say the probability of invention, like conditional on the structure of prior art, the inventions that exist before that, and the system or search process by which one typically comes from the past to the future, right? So assuming like these things, what's really like, even if I'm running a simulation, what's going to show up next year, that's not the thing that actually shows up. That improbability then becomes this novelty, which I'm going to argue stimulates both attention in the context of science and technology, and then drives advance. And there are lots of reasons why something might be surprising, because it changes understandings of modes of action in biology or in space. And they're also, they can also just be dumb, like this dumb phone, this like weightlifting. So there's lots of reasons why things can be novel. These aren't successful novelties, let's be clear. They're just novelties. And of course, Simon's written and thought a lot about this. So in this particular context, I'm going to think about, because I'm looking at lots of different kinds of discoveries and inventions across the physical sciences, across the patenting space, across the biosciences. I'm going to think about two classes of elements that compose these inventions. One are the contents. So these are the concepts, the phenomena, the tools that are inscribed in words and keywords that are curated by communities, ontologies, and things that are unlikely combinations of contents are unlikely to have been successfully combined in the past. I mean, that's, we can simply say that. We can also think about these combinations in terms of the context on which they draw. And I'll suggest why these shouldn't correlate with one another, or why they shouldn't correlate with one another in the strategic context of scientific and technological advance. Right. So contexts are like the journals, the conferences, the conversations, the events from which you draw presumably like foreign contents. And these unlikely combinations of contexts are unlikely to have been previously imagined, right? Because these are basically the sources by which these things flow together. If they've never been combined, then the conversation could, it's not only that no one successfully did it, it's that no one attempted it. And I'll show in our last context, empirical context, that this is very likely to be the case. So we looked at this in the context of, again, biosciences, physical sciences, patents. I'm happy to talk about the sample. And we built this generative hypergraph model. And the reason is because we're just, when we build, so our representation of discoveries is extremely thin. I mean, these are bags of keywords. Let's be clear. I mean, so, but we want to represent the bag, not something else. So it turns out, for example, if I'm like, hey, I'm just going to use networks to do this because networks can do everything. We can extrude this structure into a network. And if we do that, then, for example, all of the elements inside this thing will be connected in a fully connected clique. But it turns out that it's inferring all kinds of structure. Like 90% of that structure doesn't exist in the context of the actual patent or paper, right? So it's not like all those elements are all combined in the context of the paper in like a soup, that, is like a mean field, perfect mixing, context, this structure. And so if we imply structure that's not there, it decreases our prediction in this task by half, by a full 100% improvement as a function of just backing off the structure that we don't know exists. Anyway, we don't have to go deeply into this, but I'm building this manifold, this high or low, depends on how many dimensions are your favorite. This through cross-validation is like 36 dimensions. And we're capturing or identifying it as a function of the papers that are published in a given year. And then we're basically identifying or discovering these dimensions. We're generating independent variables, right, in this space, such that we maximize the likelihood that a Poisson draw from this space creates the papers that were published this year. And then we let that space like move with Brownian motion, and then we pull it down again next year, and that's our prediction for next year. And it predicts almost all the papers that we find. So we're maximizing then the probability of this graph, this hypergraph in this context, is a function of these underlying discovered dimensions, and R is just their frequency of publication. So this is kind of like the cognitive availability of those dimensions to people, right? So we're kind of just maximizing this thing, and then we're just rolling it forward. And let's see, so this is like if we just had two dimensions, and this is actually the two-dimensional kind of like space for all of the keywords in MESH, which is this biomedical information system, then the propensity that this combination will turn into a paper is this lambda, right? Is kind of like if we just do the inner product of these dimensions, right? These things that are close to, so we're basically, everything that's really close to one another is likely to be drawn together down into a hyperedge. So we're wrinkling this manifold so that it maximizes the likelihood of this production of the things that we discover. And then we just roll it forward and allow this dynamic to unfold. And this details, I'm not sure if we want to talk about the detail. I'll just mention that like negative sampling is a biased estimator of the system, but it biases against another counter bias in the system. So it's actually better than contrastive noise, which would be optimal if you wanted to make an inference rather than a prediction. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to predict. And so, because obviously we can't explore 2 to the n possible combinations. We have to balance our existing sample against some fictive sample that represents the broader space. Anyway, when we do that, the dimensions that pop out are meaningful. Parasitic diseases, basically substance abuse, mouth, jaw, tooth, and disease. Basically the dimensions that come out are reasonable dimensions in this space. And it turns out one thing just qualitatively that's interesting, and this is why network analysis on its own will not get you there, is that this is a new paper, right? And what you see is that basically everything is close to everything else in this space, but it's not equally close, right? It's not equally close in a way that can really only be captured if you effectively simulate flows or walks across the space. And that's what we're effectively doing with this manifold approach. And you'll see I'm explicitly doing it later in the talk. So if we take the inverse of this, so what are the things that are the least probable under this most probable description of papers? And I will say our AUC is about 0.93, 0.95. So it's predicting almost all combinations of the papers. It shouldn't be surprising. Science is inertial, technology is inertial. A company gets something that's successful and they invent around it and patent around it. So it's but it is capturing almost all those things. And so the things that are the least probable, right, end up being the things that are surprising to the system. And so this, for example, this paper, this theoredox, this is an actual 3-dimensional manifold squished onto the screen. Theoredoxinase, plant proteins, chromatography, and trypsin is this place where we take this discovery that a whole class of animal functions, mammalian functions, are discovered in plants. Like no one thought they were in plants. All of a sudden, this whole class of functions that we thought of being associated with motility and mobility are like, it was kind of mind-blowing paper versus other important papers that just are like totally expected. Like everyone knew that someone was going to do this with laser therapy. It had been done without that, and it was inevitable. It was doomed to succeed. And when we look at something where we're kind of like effectively surveying the community here. This is something called Faculty of 1,000. Now it's changed. It's titled the Faculty Opinions. It's a post-publication review system. So basically, people review papers and they describe them and label them as a function of what it is that they produce. And we find that content and context novelty produce different kinds of things. So content novelty is most associated with like new findings, new drug targets, kind of, like the next step in the combination of that space. Context novelty is statistically most associated with controversial findings, interesting and unusual hypothesis, and technical advance. And these are the only labels in the system, to be clear. I'm not cherry picking labels. These are like the only labels. So they're both associated with advance, but they are associated with the expected kinds of advances. Contexts are like, yeah, never thought of that before, probably wrong, right? Or at least it imperils my field, versus, and so when we look at that and, we've got content novelty versus kind of citation decile, or the degree to which this thing is appreciated. We see that it's relatively highly correlated with awards. This is basically every international award in medicine, chemistry, or biology, right? And it turns out these are the Nobel Prizes here. This is context novelty, and so it's interesting. Like content novelty is highly predictive of the associations that get awarded by the community. Context novelty is not, for any of the awards at the high decile, and it's because contexts give awards. Like awards are given by Journal X or like the Nobel Committee for Physics. It's that they systematically undervalue things relative to citations that violate their own boundaries. And then when we put these things together, they effectively produce an additive contribution to our ability to predict the amount of attention that's going to be given something in the near or distant future. So basically just ex ante, like we don't know who the people are, we don't know the journal that's published in, but ex ante, like from the moment that pre-publication shows up online, we can predict, about 50 to 60% of its likelihood of being in the top 10% of citations. So independent of any context, just as a function of these combinations, and the same is true for physics and patents. One of the things that's interesting in this speech is how is the reason why those two things are separable and almost independent, the context and the content novelty. The reason they're not exactly the same, because in prior papers they've been used as proxies of each other, is because this is the similarity of basically the keywords that you're citing, right? Or citing papers that support those keywords by the similarity of the audience to the audience that you're publishing it with. And so you're like, 500% more intensively going to cite the things that are familiar to your audience, right? So it's not building on the shoulders of giants, it's building on the shoulders of your audience. Because you're not an idiot, right? Because you know who your reviewers and, your editors are, and they're not the people who are associated with like the novel thing that's no one in your community has seen before. Patents, interestingly, are the opposite. So because if you build on the shoulders of things that are nearby, then you don't get freedom of action from a legal perspective. And so you want to basically suggest, I'm not like anything nearby. I'm really relevant to this thing that's done in a completely different field. That's the game that's being played. But that game is consequential, which is to say in the patenting space, that incentive to spread attention spreads attention. So the entropy over topics ends up being much broader in that tech space than it is in the scientific space as a function of these institutional incentives. And then we asked who made these things, right? So who, is it unusual people? Is it unusual teams? Or is it unusual expeditions, we call them, events? Like someone from this field like walks over the space and comes and solves a problem in this other field's domain. And it turns out that team and career on the low end of novelty, but the high end for all fields is systematically captured by this expedition novelty. So this is like this 3D plot. Even when team and career novelty are low, just having this expedition novelty high ends up systematically driving these most unusual things. The reason is because like a team requires a kind of social contract that everyone agrees that something meaningful is going to come out at the end. Like it requires a proof of concept that happens with these high risk kind of expeditions in the space. So effectively radical insights come in conversation with outsiders, right? Insiders and outsiders, like a context, a journal whose problem is effectively solved or addressed in a disruptive way by someone with skills, tools, and knowledge that are outside that space. And it turns out, I'm not going to talk about it, but similar patterns are when we look at startups. So this is a study of the last 60 years of venture funded startups in the US. Similar patterns of like very diverse applied technologies pulled together in these technological systems, which end up predicting the relative variance and mean of their outcome. So effectively, this idea, this conversation that crosses inside and outside, and we'll talk a little bit more about this disconnection of domains. It turns out that when we look at these conversations across science historically, that we find that this actually is the thing that characterizes modern science, right? So if you look either in terms of the semantics of the words, like the ideas, the abstracts, the papers that you draw on, or the citation diversity, just like across the journal space of co-cited journals, it doesn't matter. In any of these representations, you see this increase through the 1960s. It's about funding largely in American science, but from about the 1960s, it drops a little bit as funds become constrained, but it becomes the new normal. Right? This is how science is done. Science is done by basically, searching broadly and effectively using other sciences as the reservoir from which you draw solutions to your unsolvable problems, right? It turns out that these patterns we can see traces of in other domains as well. So this is just some work we did on political polarization. This is the differences in political consumption of books. This is book content. So it's like, okay, if I buy a Republican book or if I buy a Democratic book, then what's the likelihood that I buy these science books from any of these different fields? And it turns out, well, it dramatically impacts that likelihood. So it may be if I'm, so here's climatology, right? And so here's the Democrat co-purchases, here are the Republican co-purchases. There's not frickin' one thing, one book that anyone in these spaces has read that's the same, right? And so this actually is, it's problematic, it is, but it also is a generator of diversity, right? Again, like how deep is this climate science, this Madagascar in this system? I'm not sure. There's a few books out there, and they're largely written by political operatives. But it's but the bottom line is can we even think about unleashing this for collective benefit? And when we looked at contributions to Wikipedia as a function of just these are the bytes that people contribute, and then we weight them recursively as a function of the political likelihood so if I systematically am contributing to Republican pages, then that increases my likelihood that I have Republican commitments. And then of course that decreases as a function as the page gets bigger. We take all that into account. It predicts about 35% of the voting of individuals and their self-proclaimed ideology. So we take that signal, the more polarized, or in this case, high variance the groups are politically, this is associated with independent assessments of the quality of the pages, which are contributed, not just in terms of political pages, but also in terms of like social issues pages and science pages. What's up? You guys have, oh, no, I just, okay, great. No, if you wanted to chat, I'm happy to engage. So, no, all good. So then we kind of, we ran this assay through the system to figure out what's driving it, and it's relatively predictable things, but it's basically that these folks are talking about fewer things in more diverse ways, semantically very different kinds of ways, talking about these classes of things, and it's about balance. So if one person who's like part of a political periphery, for example, in the system, comes in, even if it's it's like a reasonable representation of that political position, it's perceived as a troll, as a function of the distribution. If they're evenly matched, then they're engaged. It actually self-disciplines the toxicity of the discussion online, et cetera. I'll just mention, I wasn't planning to do this, but there were a lot of people I was chatting with who are interested in language. We've been doing this through natural languages as well. And one of the things that we find when we look at all the languages, like 150 languages, 175 depends on, in one analysis, we have 1,000 languages, but obviously we don't have like lots of text for all those. we find, the thing that characterizes different cultures in the context of these linguistic contexts is not that, they agree on things that are concrete, for example, and disagree on things that are disparate. It's that systematically, they all agree that things that are close to one another should be close to one another. But they completely disagree on where the other classes of things that are available to them. So for example, in certain languages, you'll have healthcare being right next to the way in which people talk and think about natural phenomena like, waterfalls, bodies of water, earthquakes, mountains. And if you ask a person a question, not just, in Wikipedia, but like in a TOEFL essay, to talk about age or to talk about, then they're going to bring up metaphors and they're going to reason through these other ways in predictable ways. So if the languages are close, right, in this kind of broader global semantic space, it dramatically increases the likelihood that they'll come up with the same explanations through the same reasoning pathway. And right now we're engaged in a project to kind of look at the degree to which this is true for computer languages as people solve problems, right? So this is kind of taking this superior wharf idea, this concept that, you can't think, the strong form that I think almost no one believes in is that, you can't think things you can't speak. But the soft form is that certain representations make certain solutions more available more quickly than other solutions. And I think that's been widely demonstrated in the context. And so the idea is like, to what degree do these different ways of even computationally thinking increase the likelihood that together or collaboratively you can solve meaningful problems? This is just the results of a project that take that further and say, are there different functions that different languages can do? And here we show that, for example, semantic smoothness, right, over these language spaces, which is highly diverse. It's a normal, effectively normal distribution, dramatically impacts the social things that those languages do, right? So, for example, you speak much faster systematically when you have a semantically dense language, but you talk about fewer things because you can cycle around the same topics over and over again. So conversations occur differently as a function of these different languages in similar ways to the way in which functions pop up as a function of certain computer languages and other formal languages. I'll just mention one thing about, I chatted with like 4 people who were interested in misinformation. I didn't, I'll have to come back to talk about that work. I didn't plan for it, but I will say just 2 things that relate to this diversity hypothesis in the context of the misinformation moment that we sit in right now. One is that polarization is reinforced by social media in a way that I found in one of our recent papers. It's not published, but I'm happy to share with you, particularly nefarious. The way in which people, for example, in the Reddit space come to prominence in that space systematically is by bringing unusual things into the community and then basically engaging in a collective shame fest. So effectively, almost all of the influence that people garner is a function of their ability to kind of play the Comedy Central / Rush Limbaugh, depending on your political, and the reason this is problematic is because it's not just that people aren't exposed to some other political opinion, they're exposed to it and they're rehearsed in how to respond to it. Right. So it decreases the likelihood that you can easily break down the barriers between these systems because they're not only ready for these other things, but they have a line, by which they understand and reinforce them. And one of the things we were looking at in the context of misinformation, tagging and classifying. So online, people slap fact checks at people who are doing things that are misinformed, right? And I think in theory that would be good. The problem is 97.5% of the people who are slapping the fact checks are strongly left-leaning Democrats, and they're slapping the fact checks on everyone. And who are they slapping fact checks on? The people who they slap the fact checks on are people who are moving away from their ideological base, Democratic or Republican. So they're basically people who are leaving their epistemic or ideological bubbles and they're entering things that they don't know much about, and that's when they get disciplined. So we're basically creating a system, to try to solve the problem that's reinforcing or creating these bubbles by killing people as they kind of leave the things with which they're the most familiar. So this is, let's see, 7 minutes left. Okay, this is going to be like a super fast montage. It's going to be a blur. I'm going to do this in like 1 minute. Okay, so across innovators, teams, and fields, dense social connections distort collective certainty and slow novel discovery in advance. So we've looked at this in the context with Ling-Fei Wu here from University of Pittsburgh, who led this project. Large, tall, and sparse teams. This is a couple of papers. Dampen disruption, where small, flat, and smooth teams amplify that disruption. So we're looking at disruption as a function of the likelihood that you eclipse the work on which you build. So people look at you and they don't look at anything that you did before. And this has nice semantic and validation properties in the system. And what we see is as teams increase in size, you see this. And so basically, as teams increase in size, you have this larger overlapping, less dependent or less independent teams. You have this almost exponential decline in the likelihood that you're going to engage in disruptive behavior. And it doesn't matter where you slice this distribution. It's at the top or the bottom or the middle. And those things that are successful, why are big teams doing what it is that they do? Well, they're hedging their bets. So basically they take things that were successful, like the hits from yesterday, and they're like momentum investors. They're the fastest ones to be able to get the next incremental thing on that. It's like a production studio. Of course they're going to invest in Transformers 9. They're going to get Transformers 8 receipts minus epsilon. Like that's so that's what big teams do. Small teams end up, not the individual small team, but the distribution of small teams end up activating much more diverse pathways in the structure of popularity in the past. And it turns out a similar thing is true when we look at tall versus flat teams. And this is even larger, actually, than the team size effect, which was striking. I thought it would be like a marginal small modification. So we take what people describe as doing themselves, we cluster those things. They cluster amazingly coherently. This is the lead cluster. Lead, design, conceive, coordinate. These are the things that people actually say in this description section of the paper that they're doing. I'm not going to call it reductions into brain, muscle, and fat, but you can, draw that conclusion for yourself if you, discuss, edit, comment. Anyway, but here again we see this dramatic decline in the likelihood, with increasing or decrease, with increasing lead percentage. This kind of increase in disruption and decrease in its inverse, developmental, and an increase in novelty. And these aren't just significant, they're substantial. These are massive effects, and these are controlling for even team size. They're a larger effect than team size in this space. They also have implications for effectively equity of credit across these systems. So that's, again, gives us a sense of why they're being done. People who sit at the top, they are more productive when they run an army. But the people at the bottom are actually much less productive when they're, peons in a big pyramid in these systems. And this is where it really matters, which is to say, these small teams, these flat teams, independent of one another, are much more likely to impact the distant future in this space than the large teams, because they're because they're just momentum trading. They're just basically extending the life of the past. And the reason why this is consequential is because most large fields are growing. Think about like machine learning in this space. So I spoke at iClear in a couple of sessions to kind of explore this idea. And as those teams grow, there's an exponential decline in the likelihood that new papers will enter the canon in this space, right? So basically, it's like this massive collapse in the space of possible ideas as a function of, it's almost like a constitution, that gets formed to facilitate conversations in these spaces. And then I would say a final thing is it's not just discovery, but it's also in terms of the robustness of findings. So, we aligned, for example, hundreds of thousands of these claims from the literature with high throughput experiments that were done like 200 per test case. In this case, they're perturbagens, like drugs influencing disease-related genes. And what we find systematically is that when there's greater centralization of the community, it dramatically decreases the likelihood that those findings replicate. When you have an increase in social independence, it dramatically increases the likelihood that these things replicate. And the reason is because you can have like 50 or 100 papers that are effectively, they're not independent experiments. There's like 1.7 independent experiments underlying all those papers. And of course, the problem is, if we're trying to do something like cure healthcare or put, technologies into the wild in some uncertain settings, then, we need, multiple data points in the system. Again, another way in which, most people think about diversity as driving one of these and not the other, but it drives them both in the direction that we would find most relevant. And it turns out, this is true also for clinical trials. It turns out if you take these things into account, you can do a much better job of predicting what findings will be robust, just ex ante, just from the moment the paper is published. Or the distribution of papers are published, you can identify the relative likelihood that any one of those claims is going to hold as a function of the diversity of underlying teams, scientists, and methods that are driving it. And you can invert those into policies, like, look at this increase in the area under the curve and predicting this robustness as a function of just the number of distinctive clusters of authors, for example, in the space. And that's only one dimension. It drops, jumps from basically 0.6 to 0.9 in our ability to predict. So it's, of course, you don't want to throw everything on one thing. You want to spread it out, but you don't want what our scientific system is like almost everything is studying like some very small part of the frontier of the space. And this margin, the margin of the rest is basically spread out to these unusual topics. Right. And so it's not the worst possible strategy you could design, but it's a really bad strategy. Okay, so my final kind of move in this thing, and I have 6 seconds left in my timer. I want to hear these chimes. I want to be shamed by these chimes. So I'm gonna just let them all. Oh, that's soothing, isn't it? Okay. So I'm gonna go through this one last idea, like what happens if you try to deploy this to do something different. So can we design diversity to increase collective imagination? And I'm not going to talk about designing optimal teams, although I could. But here I'm going to talk about, can we design, basically, people that don't exist, artificial intelligence, kind of alien agents that could kind of perturb the system. So this inverts the way in which we think about the kind of imitation game approach to artificial intelligence, where we basically put like a bullseye in the back of human capacity, and we just, like reinforcement learning, just like, we just nail it. And even further than that, the kind of the machine learning version, the Arthur Samuels version, was not just a copy of the human outcomes, but copy of the human moves, right, at lower levels, which really became instantiated into the kind of artificial intelligence definition in 1955. But what if we want to think differently? Like if we want to think the least like the humans in question, and we would want to do that in any competitive setting or any indirectly competitive setting, which is to say, like when people are competing with each other against nature or against the frontier of technology, right? And so I'll just give one demonstration of how that could be efficacious. So this was a paper, I didn't publish it, it was by the material science group at the Berkeley lab and Lawrence Livermore labs. So they just used, simple and shallow and deep autoencoders to identify the likelihood that any of these materials would have a given property. The three properties they looked at were thermoelectricity, ferroelectricity, and photovoltaic capacity. So just energy storage, direction, current generation. And their precision was not tiny. It was like 0.4. They could predict the likelihood that 40% of their bets were accurate, of their positives were true positives when they looked forward 20 years into the future at any one moment in time. But I said, well, what if we wanted to, that's like a scoop machine, like how do we like do exactly what people would have otherwise done? And in fact, are in the process of doing in their labs right now. How do we just like take away their credit? It seemed silly and wrong. So I was like, well, what are the people doing? So if you just map the distribution of people in this space, you can see those things that are cognitively available and those things that are cognitively unavailable, where the authors between the property and the materials are different authors, and those where they're the same. And then, we bring in, again, my very unstructured hypergraph here, but now we have people in the hypergraph, right? So we've got people who are authoring the papers, we get the properties and the materials in the paper, and then we run 1 billion random walks over this space, right? And then the inference of the edges across that random walk are going to be precisely proportional to the cognitive availability of those hypotheses for the people in question, for people in that system in question. And it's true, this is like this heat map of the space, and it just doubles the prediction in these energy related properties to 0.8, 0.9 in the context of photovoltaic capacity. I mean, this is like this. There's almost no predictions that are not working in this context. We did the same for repurposing drugs, right? So we basically kind of identified, and here we get about a 50% lift as a function of this of taking the authors into account. When we look at something like COVID-19 vaccination search, we get a 400% increase, right? And this is because like all of a sudden this funding happens. And so no one is looking for any new starting points. Like everyone is looking for the existing starting points. Like the conservation of ideas across authors is perfectly predictive almost of the things that end up getting, like making it into clinical trials and making it into drugs. There were no new ideas that were generated, in the fall of 2019. And that this is true because you can predict the particular people that are making these particular inventions. And they're the people that sit between this material and this property. I mean, it's not perfect prediction, but it's like 0.4 prediction of this particular person. Like most of our people end up getting predicted right, even if not most of the predictions get predicted right. Okay, so here's the diversity part. So now we're gonna turn the dial the other way, right? We're going to identify things that are the most likely semantically and scientifically, but that are the least likely for humans to discover, right? So basically, you can think of us as like arbitraging this all the high dimensional gaps between every possible set of fields, right? So you can think of, science historically is cut by its joints into the chemistry department versus the physics department. So we're going to basically, capture all of those spaces and systematically identify hypotheses that sit across those spaces. We're going to turn that dial. And as we do, when we look against them, both in first principles simulations of these properties, and also in the experiments that we've done so far, as you dial out that alien side, you systematically do better, not just than that the properties that are explored by scientists, but the successful ones that are published by scientists, right? So this is an underestimation, basically, of the relative benefit of this effect. So you do, and when they're discovered, if they're discovered in real life, they're discovered much further into the future, like years into the future. Like the whole science has to reorganize before it can produce people that will discover those things in the future. And so they effectively are maximizing the complementarity effectively of these hypotheses with the system that we have at present, meaning that the total sum of innovations that end up getting discovered is much larger. So anyway, all this is to say, advance in the technological and the enterprise context is facilitated through this kind of AI provocation, right? One desideratum might be to build an ensemble of diverse intelligences as a function of the diverse human intelligences which are available to us, and to extend that diversity basically through the generation of complementary artificial intelligences. And that designing diversity ends up facilitating the ability to catalyze advance in a number of different contexts, and I won't talk about the specific details, but it also suggests the importance of thinking about a new kind of AI, kind of AI that systematically programs, but beyond the limits of individual human reason and collective human reason, that facilitates, this larger collective process of discovery. So anyway, that's all. These are some of the folks, just some of the folks that were involved in this project, and I look forward to your questions. So. Oliver.
Yeah, since you called us out, I'm going to tell you what we were
I did. I want to hear. I want it.
Yeah. So, we come from organizations, and one of the things that I kept thinking of is how hard maybe this kind of puts in context what you're talking about. How hard is this to really create in organizations in the sense that there is this tension between having diversity, and all we are doing in organizations right now is really just talking about superficial diversity. It's really just like demographic diversity with no cultural diversity because of this tension between diversity and coordination, right? And this tendency also for organizations to push us towards coordination. Because even the original, the idea that we're gonna have flatter organizations, they just create their own hierarchies, right? They create their own informal hierarchies and socialize people. And so maybe part of what I thought was, maybe this is why you're promoting the AI, because like humans can't do it.
Yeah.
But also, is there maybe another one is like, do we need to have as limited contact as we can with other people? So we have brokers that are just kind of doing the connection, but everyone else is doing their own thing. Like, how can we make more, I guess my main motivation for the question is like, how can we make more progress on achieving this in kind of the organization space?
No, I think basically I would say there's like two classes of returns that people can exploit. So one is the position in the hierarchy. You want to be on the top, not on the bottom. Another is you want to be close to the pack and not far away from the pack. And I think both of these things are things that it's going to be very hard systematically to, the returns are like, if you pose a question that no one else cares about and you're wrong, you die alone in the forest.
You can see by my citations.
Like no one will care.
You can see by my citations too. Like,
and I respect you for that. So one thing, we looked at in the context of, so the most recent team project that we were looking at was like, okay, well, what's going on? Let's see, this work. Not really. Well, okay. So imagine that you've got like I'll call this a big semantic space, and this is like the diameter on a team. There's like 6 members of the team. 3 of them are over here, in particle physics, and 3 of them are over here in evolutionary biology. They're quite distant from one another, and it turns out that diameter is dramatically associated with if you're successful, you'll be dramatically successful, but it's almost completely moderated as a function of the largest whole in this conversational space. So basically, we use persistent homology to find, so if this is the diameter here divided by n, the number of people on the team, then that would be like the most evenly spaced hole in the space. And insofar as you have holes that are larger, right, if you kind of grow from each of these epsilon balls, that dramatically decreases the likelihood that you can take advantage of these larger spaces. So I think there are things one can do exclusively in the context of organizations to stage success, right? Which is to facilitate graduated conversations across the space. But yes, the reason we're talking about AIs is because these are things not just that humans couldn't do because, they like can't think of it, although we're also trying to kind of push on the cognitive limits, but because they're not incentivized to, right? Because like they would really violate their own set of costs and benefits to do it. And these recommendations effectively are recommendations for the National Science Foundation, the NIH, the Hughes. these are system level incentive changes that can be proposed, which I think we have the opportunity to operate on. So it's a great question. But that's how we're thinking about it.
Really enjoyed your talk. There's a question somewhere in here. I'm going to try and get it out in words, so bear with me.
Surgery could be
but I'm thinking a little bit about how you might define innovation, because it seems like a little bit in the talk it's been defined in terms of like the measures that might characterize it, and that's reasonable. But my question, I'm asking this because one way could be like a discovery of a new scientific fact. Another way might be more true to what you're actually talking about here, which is like the agreement that this is an important fact, that it breaks ground in some way. Sort of it's a social process of agreeing that something constitutes an innovation, much less, and therefore much more of a social process. So I'm wondering if you're providing sort of this supports for imagination or supports for finding new innovations. I'm not sure if that, like, how. Can you talk a little bit about how you might define innovation in that context, and then also if those supports are predicting like holes where innovation might occur? If I'm understanding correctly,
sure.
Is that actually relevant to the people doing it?
I think. Well, tell me if I'm getting you right.
Yeah.
But I think I am considering like novelty.
Yeah.
and innovation is a successful novelty.
Okay.
Like something that's novel that unseats other things in the system. So most novelties don't unseat other things in the system. Simon's published as well. Most things, die in the forest alone, or they're attempted and and in fact, but we are interested in those novelties. And so I actually don't think that, and we're not just interested in the novelties that get produced, but we're interested in the space. And I think of it from a kind of evolutionary perspective, the evolving space, right? So like new functions emerge, those become new dimensions. They didn't exist before. They structure a new open simplex, right, of combinations that weren't existent prior. So I'm very much interested in the space of possible combinations, not in the space of accepted combinations. But innovation becomes those things that get picked up and when. So one thing that we're doing that I didn't talk about today, but like imagine if like this is a class of technologies, this pen is horrible. So this is even worse. Wow, I've got 3 more. Yes, juicy. Okay. So this is like an industrial system with like a bunch of different technologies. They sit in the average firm in this industry, right? And so if you basically have something that defeats in its performance relative to an accepted standard, all these things, right? Then you basically have a new firm which is going to compete or outcompete this old firm. If you have something that's going to succeed at some subset, then this firm is going to buy it. And if you have something that succeeds at things that overlap the space of industries, then it will die. Like there's no incentive, basically, there's no financial or organizational incentive to disrupt the entire, like customer production consumption base. So I'm very interested in the difference between novelty and innovation and the things that moderate that difference and how to think about time scales that might moderate or open up, what parts of the space we're even looking at, so I'm interested in attention, investment and discovery, and then innovation, which I would call displacement, does that make sense? Okay. Hi.
So again, coming from organization's perspective, but I'm just curious about, because the context you studied, these innovations and these teams don't form randomly, right? There is endogeneity in that you only are able to collaborate with people if you have some sort of common knowledge base. And you each have your own expertise, but there has to be some level of overlap in order for you to be able to do that.
That's what I was trying to suggest earlier. That the more overlap, the
I
better.
was just wondering, like, based on everything you, all of this, are you starting to get a sense of whether there might be an optimal level of overlap in knowledge base? Because there can't be zero, right? Or maybe AI will one day step in and form that brokerage role, but
You want a tool, like I get it, I want a tool as well.
fix it.
I want a decontextual tool that will work. No, I think this is a great question, and it turns out I mean, of course, this is where the case matters.
Right.
So I have a former postdoc who now as a startup for music collaboration. So I can tell you what that sweet spot is for musical collaboration, right? The experience in harmonic space, and in style space that optimizes this thing. And I'm trying to do the same for the biosciences, for the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and China's equivalent. And so I think this is where it becomes. So is there an optima? Yes, there is. But the tricky thing, this is the tricky thing, is it's not obvious that it's a equilibrium solution, right? Like it's not obvious. And in fact, there are a number of cases where you don't want all the organizations to be sitting at that peak. You actually want some like that assumes that all the market transactions take place inside the firm, right? You want search to be distributed across different kinds of actors. And so the question then becomes not just what's the optimal actor, but what's the optimal distribution of actors. And I think it's very clear from the work that we've done, which again pushes towards like a multi-agent, reinforcement learning and other, designs that really take seriously that distributional quality. So I think that's, I would push back that that's I mean, you can look at an optimal thing, but you're squeezing that thing into one dimension, and that's just like, do we want all teams to be small teams? Do we want no memory or momentum? No, that's clearly not the optimal, which means then now we've got a distribution across 2 or n types. So I think that's what we're trying to push towards, like, what are the optimal ecologies,
So in this talk, you've been talking a lot about how diversity and innovation can be good. And I was just wondering whether, so I've been thinking about both good, but also like conspiracy. I think that could be bad. You have a new combination of ideas that can be like unproductive. And I was just wondering what similarities and differences you see between sort of the good side of new and novel ideas and the bad side.
Yeah, I think you're suggesting a context that I'd love to explore more, which is basically when a novelty basically takes over the system, and its performance, is not, ends up being like some individual function, that it's activating, so it's like some cognitive, I'm like, like turned on by certain classes of videos or activated as a function of these videos, and then, collectively I end up in a place that's much less actionable from the perspective of society or whatever. So I think, or even myself, right? So my long-term self versus my short-term self, right? So I think that right now, in all the things that we've been exploring, we've assumed that the things that outcompete, right, end up being good things for the system. So we have, the whole system is not a kind of invisible hand, but that part of the system is an invisible hand. So I think that just, to study those kinds of systems, then we'd have to think differently, and I think this is where, the balance between these perspectives ends up even in other systems that we're looking at, like Wikipedia and other kinds of, production of musical and other content in these spaces, ends up facilitating things that disproportionately appeal across the space. But I think where you have, tensions between long-term and short-term, like reasons why something outcompetes, I think that's kind of like the awards that I showed you earlier. Like they're, like the awards are basically depressing innovation in science. Almost, it's very clear. And so, so I think that it's a great question. It's a class of innovations that I haven't been analyzing here. I think it requires us to think differently, different sets of metrics and optimizations, because we're optimizing, then not the individual's benefit doesn't align with the collective benefit. Yeah. So. Sure.
Just another question. One last question.
Okay.
Yeah. So do you think that if we narrow the academic problem to just looking at these highly novel spaces, so the only darts we throw are the novel darts, is it possible that the system that we currently have only kind of works because we have incentives that allow people to keep throwing darts, and that sometimes it's like a random process whether one's a hit or not? You can explain it, but if you didn't have that system in place, you might not have the structure that allows them to get the hit eventually.
Yeah, so the thing that I would totally agree with is that fields facilitate difference, sustain difference that matters. Like if everybody agreed to like converse with everybody else and to merge all of our pooled intellectual assets, then those intellectual assets would collapse. They would, we would have fields would no longer become resources to other fields, right? So difference matters, but at least in the work that we've done, systematically, there's strong incentives and an under incentive to exist and combine across disciplines. Like even if we take that collapse into account. So I think you're right, memory matters. Like we should like retain memory like in these systems, but we've got a lot of memory. There are universities that are 100% memory and zero innovation. And so, so I think the balance point is where is it exactly? We're trying to figure out what that is, but it's far away from the point that we're at currently. If we were trying to design science, knowledge, technology for innovation, if we were trying to do that. Yeah. So.
I just realized we have one question that came online that I wanted to ask.
Matthew Hicks asks, do you have innovation paper topic generators for different communities of interest? Could you use this to generate large state spaces of possible scientific black swans?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. These models produce such things. And in fact, I'm on sabbatical this year. And so what's Matthew?
Matthew Hicks.
Okay,
Yes.
hi, Matthew. So one of my goals this year on sabbatical is to build an enormous server farm where I'm just farming conjectures. Finance, physics, math, culture, like all that, I just want to, I want to just farm these to provoke, not just to, automatically generate, but to provoke the system. So I think that's a great idea. And that's what I want to do this year. So anyone who wants to play in that space, come talk, yeah.
Awesome.
So
On that note, thank you again.